Today we're looking at Luke chapter 12, verses 22 to 34. Now this passage, this section of Luke chapter 12, actually begins with the word therefore. You see, Jesus and Luke are pointing us back and reminding us of what he's just talked about. He's told this story of the man who was trying to store up wealth for himself for the future. And Jesus' point there is that we need to value God above everything else. And so on the basis of that, on the basis of this truth, that we should value God above all else, then Jesus says, don't worry. If you're not storing up in barns, if you're not storing up your wealth, if you're not finding your security there, Jesus says, don't worry about the future, because that will be the tendency, right? That's sort of the antidote that we find for ourselves. The antidote to worry is I'm going to build my security, so I'm going to have all that I need, and then I won't worry. And Jesus says, I don't want you to build up so that you have all that you need in a physical sense, but I also don't want you to worry. You see, the key question that Jesus wants to ask us, remember, I'm going to say it again and again, the gospel, we want the gospel to transform us from the inside out in our everyday living. And so the key question then that Jesus asks us to illuminate whether the gospel is doing that transforming work in our lives is, what is it that you worry about? Or another way that you could say it is, where is your faith? What are you putting your security in? You see, some of us, the tendency could be to say, right, I totally agree. I'm not going to store up wealth because I want to value God above all else. But then we say, I'm not storing up wealth, so I'm just going to worry instead. And Jesus says, I don't want you to store up wealth, but I also don't want you to worry. You see, it's a question of faith. It's a question of where we get our security. Now, I just want to make one important note. None of this is a statement about fiscal responsibility. I'm not suggesting that you not be wise with your income. I'm not suggesting that you make foolish choices and say, oh, well, God's got it. That's not what this is. This is a question about our heart and whether or not it's being transformed by the gospel. It's a question of how we think about our resources, not just money, but time and physical resources as well as our money. But it's a question of where our heart is and where our thinking is, not so much the sort of practical responsibility. I just want to say that. But in asking this question, what is it that you worry about? I think that what we find is that worry illuminates our hearts in two specific ways. The first way is that we make God too small. When we worry, we make God too small. If you look at chapter 12, verses 23 and 24. He says, for life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable are you than the birds? You see, when we worry, what we've said is, God, I'm not sure that you can actually look after me. And you see, and Jesus is saying here, if I can look after the birds, surely I can look after you. But our worry says, I'm not sure that you can. Or if you're thinking about the guy from the previous story, then you might be saying, our worry might be not be worrying, but we store up in barns because we're saying, well, God might not be able to take care of me. So I'm just going to make sure that I set aside for myself. It's okay, God, I've got this bit, right? So our worry first tells us that we're making God too small. The second way that it illuminates our hearts is that we make ourselves too big. When we worry, we make God too small, but we also make ourselves too big. Look at verses 25 and 26. Who of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this very little thing, why do you worry about the rest? You see, Jesus is asking a bit of a rhetorical question there, isn't he? But actually, it's, I don't know, almost more harsh than that, because if you think about it, what we know today, science tells us that actually worrying shortens your life. So Jesus is literally saying, not only can worrying, not all of your worrying, all of your concern, all of your fear, it doesn't actually add anything to your life. And in fact, it might take some things away from you. It might prevent you from living in the way that God has called you to live. And so instead, what Jesus wants to teach us is that the gospel can transform the way that we think about our resources, not only to say, I don't have to store up, I value God more, but also to say, I have enough confidence and security in God to know that He can look after me. Whatever it is that He calls me to, wherever He's leading me, my confidence grows because my faith is secure in who God is and who Jesus is, and not in who I am. The gospel transforms us in that way. If you look at verses 29 to 31, Jesus ends the story and He says, do not set your heart on what you will eat or drink. Don't worry about it. For the pagan world runs after all such things, and your Father knows that you need them. But seek His kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well. You see, Jesus' response is, the gospel transforms us. Everybody else is going to chase after those things. Everybody else is going to be worrying about those things. It's human nature. It's, in one sense, almost common sense. Of course, people worry. But Jesus says the thing that separates you, that sets you apart as a follower of Christ, that demonstrates gospel transformation happening inside of you, is that when everybody else is worrying about these things, you're saying, I'm not worrying about that, but instead, I'm pursuing the kingdom, I'm seeking the kingdom. And if you're not sure what seeking the kingdom looks like, he unpacks it there for you just after that. He says, don't be afraid, but instead sell your possessions and give to the poor. Can you imagine that? I'm not setting aside wealth for myself. I'm not investing my security in what I can do for myself. I'm not going to worry about what I don't have. And instead, I'm going to just be generous and give away and do justice and pursue the work of the kingdom. That is some real gospel transformation at work.